Jaden moved carefully through the crumbling walls of the old building, his bare feet silent against the broken pavement beneath him. The harsh reality of his neighborhood pressed in from every side. Dilapidated buildings with cracked windows, graffiti-covered walls, and the constant sound of distant sirens. The streets he called home weren't kind, and he had learned early on to fend for himself. At just 10 years old, Jaden had no choice but to grow up fast. His days were spent scavenging for food, staying out of trouble, and doing whatever it took to survive. The sun was beginning to set, casting a dim light across the streets as Jaden made his way through another abandoned building. He hadn't eaten all day, and his stomach growled with hunger. He had heard whispers of food scraps left behind by people who lived in the area, and Jaden was hoping to find something to ease his gnawing hunger. He walked cautiously, eyes scanning the dark corners of the building, staying alert. As he moved deeper into the building, the noise of his footsteps echoed off the walls. He paused, hearing a soft sound, a faint cry. His heart skipped a beat, and for a moment he wondered if his mind was playing tricks on him. But then he heard it again, louder this time, a soft, desperate cry. It came from somewhere deeper inside the building. Curiosity piqued, Jaden followed the sound, moving cautiously through the maze of broken doors and corridors. As he turned a corner, he froze in place. There, in the middle of a dilapidated bathroom, was a tiny figure. A baby, no more than a few weeks old, wrapped in a pink blanket, lying alone on the cold concrete floor. Jaden's eyes widened in disbelief. His heart raced, and a mix of emotions flooded him: confusion, fear, and something else he couldn't quite name. How could a baby end up here, in this abandoned place? He could feel the weight of the situation, the urgency, but his survival instincts kicked in. Was it safe to get involved? He didn't know who the baby was or who would come looking for it. For a long moment he stood there, torn between his natural caution and his growing compassion. But then something inside him shifted. His heart won out over the voice that told him to turn away. Without another thought, Jaden moved toward the baby, kneeling beside her. He gently scooped her up, cradling her in his arms as she continued to cry. The baby's tiny form felt fragile in his hands, but he held her carefully, his protective instincts kicking in. He couldn't leave her here. No matter how hard his life had been, no matter how little he had, this innocent child needed him. The conditions of the room, broken windows, peeling paint, and garbage strewn about, didn't matter. The baby needed safety, warmth, and care, and Jaden would give her that. He looked around the room for anything that could help. Finding a dirty towel on the floor, he wrapped it around the baby to keep her warm, hoping it would offer some comfort. Jaden knew that he couldn't stay here. He had to get her out of this building, away from the dirt and decay that seemed to permeate everything in his life. With the baby still in his arms, he moved cautiously through the building, stepping over debris and avoiding broken glass. His mind raced as he thought of where he could take the baby. He had no family of his own, no safe place to go, but there had to be someone, somewhere, who could help. Jaden's mind snapped back to the present. He couldn't think of all the obstacles now. The baby was depending on him, and he couldn't let her down. He made his way out of the building and into the streets, determined to find safety for her. He passed by people, but no one seemed to notice him or the tiny, fragile child in his arms. They were too caught up in their own lives. The sky had darkened by the time Jaden reached the edge of the neighborhood. His feet were sore, but he didn't stop. There was a wealthy neighborhood just beyond the rundown part of the city, and he hoped someone there might help. Finally, he arrived at a tall iron gate which led to a beautiful mansion. It seemed like a world away from the streets he had just walked. Jaden approached the gate hesitantly, his heart pounding in his chest. He rang the doorbell, still unsure of what he was doing. Minutes later, a butler opened the door, surprised to see a young boy standing there with a baby in his arms. Jaden explained the situation as best as he could, and after a few moments of hesitation, the butler let them inside. Jaden didn't know it yet, but the man who lived here, the millionaire Victor, was about to change his life forever. The baby's true identity would come to light, and Victor would see Jaden not as just a boy from the streets, but as a hero who had saved his daughter. The next day, Victor would come to Jaden with a life-altering offer, one that would change everything for both of them. Victor paced the length of his grandiose living room, his every step a sign of his mounting anxiety. The opulence of the mansion, with its marble floors and high ceilings, felt suffocating in that moment. Isabella, his wife, sat on the couch, her eyes red from hours of crying. Her hands were trembling as she gripped the phone tightly, staring at the screen as though willing it to bring her some good news. Their baby, their precious little girl, had been missing for hours. The police had been notified, but the search was turning up nothing. Victor couldn't sit still anymore. His mind raced, his thoughts drowning in fear, guilt, and frustration. How could this have happened? His daughter was supposed to be safe. She had been right there in the yard with the nanny just a moment ago. And now she was gone. Victor's sharp, authoritative mind was usually in control, but today it was fractured by panic. He couldn't focus, couldn't make sense of the events unfolding around him. Isabella, usually composed, was a shadow of herself. She hadn't stopped crying since the moment they realized their daughter was missing. He could see it in her eyes. She was barely holding on, and he couldn't bear to watch her suffer. "Where is she?" Isabella whispered through her tears, her voice fragile. "Why can't they find her?" Victor stood still, his chest tight. The anger he had towards the situation was suffocating. What kind of world was this? His wealth, his status, none of it could protect his family from the horrors of a world he had tried so hard to shelter them from. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and for a moment he froze, hoping for something, anything that could ease the fear gnawing at him. He yanked the phone from his pocket and looked at the screen. The name on the caller ID was unfamiliar, but the moment he answered, a voice on the other end gave him the news he had been both hoping and dreading. "This is Jaden," said a young voice, calm but urgent. "I have your daughter." Victor's heart stopped. He could feel his pulse quicken, his breath catching in his throat. "Where is she? What happened? How is she?" Victor's voice was sharp with panic. "I found her in an old building, all alone," Jaden explained. "She was scared, but I've got her. She's safe. You can come get her now." Victor's breath caught in his throat. The relief was immediate, but it was laced with disbelief. How could this boy, this stranger, have found their daughter when the police had come up empty-handed? His mind swirled, trying to process what he was hearing. "Where are you?" Victor demanded, his voice thick with emotion. Jaden gave him the location, a rundown neighborhood on the outskirts of town, a far cry from the safety and wealth of the mansion. Victor didn't hesitate. He couldn't. His heart beat in his ears as he snapped into action. "I'll be there in 10 minutes," he said, his voice firm despite the flood of emotions threatening to overtake him. He hung up and turned to Isabella, who had been listening intently, her face pale. "Is she okay?" Isabella whispered, her voice barely audible. Victor could only nod. He couldn't find the words to explain what he was feeling. Relief, confusion, gratitude, and something else. Something deeper that he couldn't place yet. "I'll get her," he said. "Stay here. I'll bring her home." Isabella's hand reached out, grabbing his arm as he turned to leave. "Please, be careful." Victor nodded again, his mind already racing ahead, focused only on reaching Jaden and their daughter. As he sped out of the mansion and onto the street, his mind couldn't help but churn. Who was this boy? Why had he gone out of his way to help? What did he expect in return? The questions whirled in his mind, but the only thing that mattered right now was that his daughter was alive. He arrived at the location Jaden had provided, his heart pounding with both dread and anticipation. As he got out of the car and saw the rundown building in the distance, the weight of the situation hit him full force. The world that had once been so familiar, so comfortably detached from hardship, felt far away. His eyes searched the area desperately. Was this really the boy who had saved his daughter? Would he understand? Would he even want to? As the reality of the situation settled over him, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude for the unknown boy who had risked it all to bring his daughter home. But more than that, he knew, without a doubt, that this was only the beginning of a much bigger story. The old, crumbling building stood ahead as Victor stepped out of the car, his body tense, his mind clouded with doubt. He wasn't sure what he expected, but standing in front of this dilapidated structure, so far from the wealth and luxury he was accustomed to, made him uneasy. The very streets he had been warned to avoid seemed to echo with a warning, yet his daughter's life was on the line. His gaze hardened, and with one last glance at his team of officers and security personnel, he approached. Victor had always been a man in control, his life neatly planned and executed. He had wealth, power, and influence. But today, it seemed those things meant nothing. His mind kept circling back to the question of who this boy was, this boy who had saved his daughter, and why he was here. Why would someone like him risk his life for someone like Isabella? As Victor reached the corner of the building, he saw Jaden, bloodied but standing tall, holding his daughter, wrapped in a makeshift blanket. His daughter, Victor's heart was nearly in his throat as he saw her alive. He could breathe again. Jaden was a young black boy from a rough neighborhood, dressed in ragged clothes, his face a reflection of a life of struggle. He stood there, holding Isabella's daughter with care, his eyes focused on nothing but her. There was no hint of selfishness, no attempt at glory, just a quiet resolve. And for a fleeting moment, Victor saw that Jaden was no different from any other person who might have stepped in to save a life. But his instinct, clouded by his biases and fears, kicked in. Victor strode forward, his heart still pounding, but his mind clouded with confusion and something else, discomfort. He was a man who was used to things happening on his terms. He wasn't used to being unsure. As he approached, his voice was cold and cutting. "You've no idea how much trouble you've caused," Victor snapped, his anger flaring up again. "You just brought this child out of nowhere. Who are you, really?" The words tumbled out, raw and accusatory, like a knee-jerk response to the situation that was spiraling out of his control. The words hit Jaden like a punch to the gut. He had risked his life to save Victor's daughter, had fought against the fear, the flames, the debris, all to bring Isabella's child to safety. And yet here he was, being questioned as if he were the villain. The hurt was evident in his eyes, But Jaden stood tall. He knew better than to shrink under the weight of Victor's words, but it didn't make them hurt any less. Victor's gaze, filled with suspicion and doubt, raked over Jaden's worn clothes. "You're just a street kid. You think you're a hero?" Victor sneered, his voice laced with disdain. "What's your game? You want something from me? You want money? Fame?" Jaden's chest tightened, and the sound of the crowd around him murmured louder. The words "street kid," "thug," "dangerous" swirled through the air. People questioned his motives, his right to save a life. The very people who had witnessed his act of bravery now stood in judgment of him. And it wasn't just Victor. It was the officers standing nearby, watching quietly, some with raised eyebrows, some glancing at each other with barely concealed suspicion. Jaden's hands trembled as he stood still. He had expected the world to be hard on him, but this moment, it was a slap in the face. His mind raced, questioning why he had bothered. Why had he risked everything for a child he didn't know, only to be treated like a criminal for doing the right thing? The murmurs of doubt from the crowd continued. "What's he doing here?" one voice asked. "Just a poor kid, doing God knows what," another voice sneered. Victor turned away briefly, his chest tightening with the weight of his anger and confusion. He didn't know how to process this. He had expected gratitude, thanks, acknowledgement. Instead, he saw only a young man from a world he didn't understand, acting out of some misguided sense of heroism. But then, in the midst of the chaos, Isabella, still pale and shaking from the ordeal, collapsed into Victor's arms. Her body gave out from the shock, the physical and emotional weight of the day too much for her to bear. Victor barely noticed her fall as he continued to glare at Jaden, unaware that his wife needed him more than ever. She couldn't defend Jaden. She couldn't speak up for the boy who had saved their daughter's life. Jaden stood frozen, unable to speak. The injustice of the situation seemed to suffocate him. He had saved Isabella's child, put his life on the line to get her to safety, and yet he stood here, alone in his defense. He could feel the weight of the crowd's suspicion bearing down on him. The silence after Victor's words felt oppressive, as if the whole world was judging him for something he hadn't done. The tears, the sweat, the fear, all of it seemed meaningless now. He had done everything right, and yet it wasn't enough. In that moment, Jaden wasn't sure if he wanted to stand tall anymore. He wasn't sure if he wanted to be a hero. But as the crowd's murmurs swelled, he couldn't help but wonder how he had ended up here. Hero 1 minute, criminal the next, all because of the color of his skin. The mansion felt colder than usual as Victor and Isabella arrived, the sounds of the busy city muted by the heavy weight of what had transpired. The baby, wrapped in soft blankets, rested in Isabella's arms. But there was no joy in the moment. Victor's mind was elsewhere, lost in the whirlwind of emotions and conflicting thoughts from the day. He couldn't shake the image of Jaden, bloodied but standing tall, holding Isabella's daughter with such care and determination. Victor had been so quick to judge, so blinded by his own fear and privilege, that he hadn't once stopped to consider the truth. The boy had saved his daughter's life, but instead of offering thanks, he had thrown accusations and distrust at the one person who had stepped in when no one else did. Later that night, in the quiet of the hospital room, Victor sat beside Isabella, who was still recovering from the shock. Her exhaustion was palpable, but her eyes, though tired, carried a deep concern for what had happened. As she softly spoke to the nurse about her recovery, Victor leaned back in the chair, staring at the hospital room's sterile white walls. His thoughts were filled with the image of Jaden again. His face, those dark eyes, filled with something Victor couldn't name. Was it courage? Was it the way he had acted without hesitation to save someone else? Jaden had risked his life without thinking about the consequences. But all Victor had seen in him was a threat. He had seen the color of Jaden's skin before he saw his bravery. Victor's stomach churned as the realization began to sink in. He had wrongly accused Jaden. He had assumed the worst of a boy who had given everything to save someone else. Jaden had stood in the flames of danger to protect his family, and yet all Victor had seen was a threat. In that moment, Victor knew. It wasn't Jaden who was in the wrong, it was him. His pride and biases had clouded his judgment, and it sickened him. What did it say about him? How could he have been so blind, so quick to disregard the life of a young hero just because he came from the wrong side of town? He sat up straight, suddenly feeling the weight of the years of judgment, the expectations placed on him as a wealthy, successful man. Had his wealth and position really made him this blind to the truth? He had always assumed his position entitled him to certain privileges, but now those privileges felt hollow. He had allowed his prejudice to overshadow everything that truly mattered. Isabella, sensing the change in him, reached out and touched his hand. "Victor," she said softly, her voice filled with concern, "you're thinking too much. Jaden saved our daughter. Don't let your own anger cloud that truth. He did something that none of us could have." Victor turned to her, his eyes filled with remorse. "I've done something awful, Isabella," he confessed, his voice thick with guilt. "I treated him like a criminal. I accused him when he was the one who saved her. And now I don't know how to fix it." Isabella squeezed his hand, offering silent support. But deep down, Victor knew that the damage had been done. He had tarnished the moment, tarnished Jaden's actions with his own misplaced fears and assumptions. The hours passed, and the weight of his regret became heavier. He paced the hospital room, replaying the scene in his mind. The boy, the hero, and the man who had failed to recognize him. He knew he couldn't let it go. He needed to make things right, even if it meant swallowing his pride and admitting he was wrong. Because Jaden deserved so much more than the judgment he had been given. Victor knew what he had to do now. He had to apologize, not just for the accusations, but for the hurt he had caused. He had to give Jaden what he deserved, respect, recognition, and the chance for a better future. Only then would he be able to right the wrong he had done. Days passed, and Jaden couldn't shake the surreal feeling that had settled over him. The trauma from the accident, the racism, the accusations. It all seemed like a nightmare he was struggling to wake up from. Despite his bravery, despite saving a life, he was still treated like an outsider, a criminal, someone who didn't deserve to exist in the world of the wealthy, the powerful. But then, just when Jaden had resigned himself to his life on the streets, he received an unexpected call. It was Victor. His heart skipped a beat. The voice on the other end was steady, but Jaden could hear the sincerity behind the words. "Jaden," Victor's voice broke through the phone, "can we meet? There's something I need to talk to you about." Jaden's mind raced. After everything that had happened, the accusations, the humiliation, he wasn't sure he wanted to meet with Victor again. But curiosity and a faint spark of hope pushed him forward. He agreed, and they arranged to meet in the very neighborhood where Jaden had once struggled to survive. When Jaden arrived at the familiar spot, he couldn't believe his eyes. There, standing in front of the modest building, was Victor, looking out of place in the gritty surroundings. His suit gleamed under the sun, a sharp contrast to the broken pavement beneath their feet. "Jaden," Victor greeted him, his voice warm but filled with uncertainty. "I owe you an apology. I've thought a lot about what happened, and I've come to realize just how wrong I was." Jaden was taken aback. He didn't know what to say. Victor had been so cold before, so distant. He had accused him of things he didn't deserve. And now, here he was, standing in front of him, admitting his mistakes. Victor's eyes looked deep into Jaden's as he continued. "You saved my daughter's life," Victor said softly, "but you saved something else too. You saved me. I was blind, but I see clearly now. I've spent my whole life valuing things that didn't matter. You taught me that." Jaden stood frozen. The words, the apology, it was more than he could have ever imagined. All those nights spent in the dark, thinking the world would always judge him, had led to this moment. A man who had once looked down on him was now acknowledging his worth. And then Victor spoke again. "I've thought about this for a long time," he said. "I want to adopt you. I want to make you my son. You'll be an heir to everything I have. You'll have opportunities, a future, your future." Jaden's mind reeled. The weight of Victor's words hit him like a tidal wave. A part of him felt overwhelmed, unable to process what was happening. This wasn't just about saving a life anymore. This was about an entirely new life. A life of possibilities he had never even dreamed of. Victor continued, "I don't expect you to say yes right away, but I want you to know that you have a place in my family. You deserve everything." Jaden was speechless, his heart racing. He had always known that he had value, but hearing Victor say those words out loud made him realize just how far he had come. He had survived, fought, and made it through. And now, for the first time, he was being recognized not as a burden, but as someone worthy of love and opportunity. After a long silence, Jaden finally nodded. "Yes, I'll do it. I'll be your son." Victor smiled, a mix of relief and genuine affection in his eyes. He stepped forward and shook Jaden's hand. "Thank you, Jaden. You've changed everything. I promise you won't regret this." In the weeks that followed, Jaden moved into Victor's mansion. It was an overwhelming transition, from the streets to a life filled with luxury and comfort. But Jaden didn't let it change him. He worked hard, studied, and embraced the opportunity to better himself. Isabella, who had once been a distant figure, now became a loving and supportive mother figure in his life. Years passed, and Jaden grew into a young man of integrity, intelligence, and strength. He never forgot his roots, but the family he had gained provided him with everything he needed to succeed. He studied business, worked tirelessly, and learned from the best. On the day he walked confidently into the family business, he was no longer the scared, unsure boy who had rescued Isabella. He was a leader, standing tall beside his father, Victor, who now proudly introduced him to the world as his son. The family was there, Victor, Isabella, and their daughter, standing together as a united, loving family. The final shot captured Jaden, a young man who had come from nothing, now at the helm of the empire that once seemed so far out of reach. His future was no longer a question. It was a promise fulfilled. As he walked into his new life, Jaden understood that his journey had been about more than just survival. It had been about finding his place in the world, a place where he was valued, loved, and, most importantly, seen for who he truly was.